history from famous people, celebrities, legal cases to sort of give you a full swath of how different challenges have been answered without giving people any concrete answer.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. So what was your inspiration for writing this book? I mean, there are a number of medical ethics textbooks. This is not that. It's very much a way to engage with some of these problems. What was your inspiration for writing it?
Well, I was thinking that there are far too many Americans who are happily married, and I wanted something for them to argue about. And I figured this book would be a great book. So one of the goals of the book, more seriously, is to bring these bioethical dilemmas to lay people. And I think one of the reasons there's so much strife in our country in terms of public discourse is we're unable to recognize that people who disagree with us, maybe people of goodwill, who simply start with different premises, so they come to different conclusions. And one of the goals of this book is to promote civil discourse around complex bioethical issues. So you may say, I feel strongly about this, but I understand that people who feel the opposite way aren't fools. They simply have different premises and different values, so they come to different conclusions.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, especially when you get into medical issues, everything is so complicated and complex, and there are so many options that people don't even really understand. You know, the disagreements can be sort of caricatured in the media, but really it's a lot of reasonable people coming to different conclusions.
Absolutely. And I will add, this book came out about a month before the pandemic started, and there are two consequences to that. One, there are about 30,000 copies waiting to be sold at the publishers' warehouses. But the other is that many issues that didn't seem like they were relevant to the everyday lives of ordinary people suddenly seem very relevant to the everyday lives of ordinary people.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So as you said, you know, the book is aimed at a broad audience. So, you know, what do you hope that people who aren't medical professionals can kind of take away from this sort of discussion? So, you know, you said that it's sort of to spark conversation, but ideally, what are some of the nuggets you hope they would take?
Sure. Well, my secret dream is that everybody out there becomes a professional bioethicist. But I'm realistic enough to know that many of you are not going to give up your careers and your families and join me in bioethics anytime soon. So part of it is simply to keep people informed about these issues, to have them, they don't have to agree with me, but they should be able to articulate a reasonable argument about any hot button bioethics topic they see in the news. And another goal is to show them how interesting these cases can be, so that things that were taught in high school or college in a very dry way can actually prove fascinating when you dig into the details.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, it's like so many of these cases we hear about in the abstract. And you've done a really nice job of bringing sort of the history of some of these conversations to bear on the questions, or to explain how they've emerged in our sort of public conversation, but also the very narrow details of how they might apply in particular patients' lives.
Well,
Now, go
my
ahead.
mentor at Brown, this is a quote many may be familiar with, used to say that facts without theory is trivia, but theory without facts is BS. And so to talk about these issues, you actually need to have empirical evidence and then a theoretical framework.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. And you know, the back cover of your book says that, you know, you're drawing on 2 decades of teaching medical ethics along with your work as a psychiatrist. Can you tell us a little bit about your clinical work and the sorts of ethical challenges that you've wrestled with in your practice?
Sure. So I can give people like my 30-word background and explain how I got where I am today, which is that my grandfather ran the Army's facility for the criminally insane during World War II in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So the one thing I knew I did not want to be in life was a psychiatrist. In 3rd grade, we had to choose a poster for career day, and I made a poster of my career, and my career was not a psychiatrist. I had a picture of a psychiatrist with a slash through it. My grandfather in the early 50s had actually done shock therapy in his home office on his dining room table. And my mother would carry up the table they used for holiday dinners, and they would do shock therapy on it and then bring it back downstairs. So with that background, I was sure I wasn't going to be a doctor. I went and taught bioethics at Brown for about 9 years. After 9 years of being hired on a year-to-year contract, the dean thanked me for the job I was doing and explained that he was going to hire an MD to do it, which is how I ended up in medical school. They actually asked me if I would teach that person how to do it before I left. With that in mind, I fell in love with psychiatry, and now I do 2 different things. I work usually at night in one of the busiest, and it actually is the busiest psychiatric emergency room in New York City. So I see a very wide swath of human behavior, some good and some not so good. And then I teach the ethics curriculum for the first, second year medical students and a number of the residency and fellowship programs in Mount Sinai. So it's sort of two very different worlds.
Yeah, yeah, very different worlds. And so, what sort of ethical challenges do you face in that? I mean, that, one, there's sort of these general ethical challenges that you've raised in your book, but also working night shift, in my world as a clinical ethicist seems very different from the day shift. There's a lot of different pieces of communication that don't get transferred to the night shift. There are a lot of different sort of conundrums that arise when you don't have certain people in authority over the medical situation. And what sort of challenges have you faced?
Well, I will add one of the reasons I work the night shift is you don't have people in authority in certain situations. I always say the one great thing about my job is I never see administrators. I will probably see them once when they walk me out of the building. But until then, so it's interesting because it is a different set of ethical dilemmas. One of the most challenging ones, and I do some of my academic research on malingering, people who fake either medical or psychiatric illness. And the challenge arises when you have patients who have a legitimate social service need. They're homeless and need a place to stay, they're hungry and need food, but they don't need an admission to the hospital for $4,000 a night. And yet often that's what they, in practice, would need to keep them out of the rain. How do you balance your commitment to helping people with your commitment to preserving resources for both the taxpayers and patients with psychiatric needs?
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? Because we try to avoid the sort of bedside rationing because we want physicians to be committed to their patients. At the same time, it's like you're in these positions where you don't have a choice but to try to figure out how to navigate these situations. That's interesting stuff.
And obviously patients who we're not sure whether they're feigning illness or not, we give them
Yeah.
But I've had patients who come into the ER and they actually have memorized the New York State statute. And they'll say, well, I'm here because I'm a danger to myself, I'm a danger to others, I'm gravely disabled, and et cetera, et cetera. And they're sitting there smiling.
Right.
Those are people we may give a sandwich, but we probably shouldn't give an ICU bed.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And right. And just knowing, like having the wisdom to sort of figure out how to handle those situations, like to know when they're genuinely, there's a medical need here that needs to be addressed and whether they're just sort of using the system in a certain way. I mean, we think about medicine in very practical terms, but there's a bit of wisdom that comes with those sorts of decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I always say you try to not forget as a doctor what you know as a human being, which is easy to say on a Zoom call, but much harder when people are shouting at you in a busy ER.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So I also work as a clinical ethicist, and so reading this book, I'm thinking about the challenges that we face. And one challenge that we face with advanced directives, for example, is how little people know about the sorts of treatments they might be offered and what they would involve. And so, even if they were willing to complete what we call a living will, which is this sort of advanced directive about particular medical treatments that they might want under certain conditions, they don't know what to put in it. And it's hard to coach them about what to put in it. And so, do you think that books like yours could help prepare people for thinking about their future medical preferences?
Absolutely. I hope one of the things that comes out of this book is people realizing that a particular dilemma may not occur in their family, but a dilemma will occur in their family. They will face some medical ethical crisis during their lifetimes because many of us do. And the best way to avoid that is to plan in advance. So I always ask people in audiences like this, how many of you have a living will or healthcare proxy of some kind of advanced directive? And majority of people in an educated audience like this will raise their hands. And then I ask them, how many of you have it on you? And nobody raises their hand. And sometimes when I'm feeling particularly, when I want to make things a little more complicated for the audience, to put it politely, I'll ask them where they have it and call on someone. And invariably somebody says in their safe deposit box. And that should give us all pause, because when you, God forbid, get hit by a bus outside the event and you go to the hospital, having your proxy forms in your safe deposit box does you no good. So if you take nothing practical out of this event, right now, it's to photocopy your healthcare proxy form or advanced directive to a small piece of paper, ideally put it in either your wallet or your purse, or at least put it on your cell phone. And then I always tell people, tell your proxies where this form is and tell them that they're your proxy. I cannot tell you how many times as a psychiatric consultant, I will call up the proxy and say something like, Uncle Fred is doing really badly. You're his healthcare proxy. What would you like done? And they'll say, I'm Uncle Fred's proxy. Once a number of years ago, this is real, we arranged for a conference call with a foreign country and it involved time zones and translators. And the person in shock said, I have an Uncle Fred. So you really want to make sure they know.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk about some of the limitations of advanced directives, and part of the limitations is you have no idea what to expect. You have no idea whether you're going to have a traumatic brain injury or you're going to have an aneurysm, right? You have no idea what to expect. So figuring out what to put in an advanced directive is difficult, but at least naming someone and letting that person know that you've named them and having some conversations about the sorts of medical care you want, like, is super important for these moments.
The hard part, of course, is that we know people bargain down.
Yeah.
That people will say, I never want to live in a particular condition. But then when they find themselves in that condition, they say, this is not as bad as I thought it was. I still want to live this way. So how do you balance that against specifying what you want done when you're no longer able to make decisions? And there's no easy answer to that, but it's really one of the conceptual challenges with advanced directives.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things that we wrestle with is a notion of ableism, where you realize that becoming disabled in certain ways is a process, and you adapt to processes. Like, human beings are immensely adaptable, and the things that from our sort of able-bodied perspectives that we anticipate that we wouldn't want to live with, when we get there, we realize, oh man, I had no idea that, like, this is not only acceptable, but this could actually be a high quality way of living. And so, yeah, sort of coaching people through that and having those conversations, like recognizing that it's hard to anticipate, but also facilitating good conversation with the person's proxy about what was valuable to them.
Yeah, I mean, people often have the mistaken belief that bioethicists make decisions with a capital T. Most of the time, I find we're offering people permission. They have a pretty good sense of what they want done. We're helping them figure it out, the details of that, and then sort of saying that someone with some level of gravitas, the hospital system, ethicist, won't judge them for making the choice they want to make.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel the same way about the work that I do as a clinical ethicist. Like, and in so many cases, especially in pediatric cases, we're sort of reassuring parents. It's like, no one is going to feel that you're not being a good parent by making X decision, whatever X decision is. Like, we are trying to partner with you. But there's very much this sort of concern that they're going to be viewed a certain way. So I appreciate that point.
And then there's also the challenge of Ulysses contracts, which I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with, basically binding yourself to a future situation irrevocably. The term comes from, and I will confess my classics aren't that good, which is why I'm in medicine and not in history. But Odysseus, who in Latin is Ulysses, was supposed to come back from Ithaca, which is not where Cornell is located. And on the way back, he was going to listen to the beautiful sounds of the sirens, but they kill you. And I acknowledge this is a deeply sexist ancient story. So he had his sailors put beeswax in their ears and then tie them to the mast. And he said, no matter how much I beg you or suggest to you that I want to be released, don't release me so I can hear the sound without being killed. In essence, that is what many of our patients do when they say, if I end up in this condition, don't do anything to undo it. I'm binding myself to a future choice.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting questions around these Odysseus contracts, these Ulysses contracts, about your sort of preferences that you have in advance that you can't anticipate, the sort of condition you will be in, and then of course the adaptive preferences that you might have once you're in those positions, and how binding we should allow those things to be. And as you mentioned in the book, like, different states have different criteria for what counts as a binding Ulysses agreement.
And I will add, I am confident that the American Classics Association is now trying to have me canceled. It was clearly not the best presentation of Homer ever done, but you'll have to bear with me.
That's fair. So you have got, a couple of these topics that you've talked about, right? So, I mean, some of them are sort of classic big picture topics, but some of them are very, very close to us in our contemporary pandemic scenario. This is why we're on Zoom today. So you've got a chapter, for example, called A Modern Typhoid Mary. And while it's primarily about mandatory quarantine, it's also relevant to current concerns about vaccine mandates. I even know someone who calls the people who refuse to wear masks in public typhoid Marys. And so do you have ideas about how ethicists and the healthcare community can engage with the broader public to sort of allay some of the fears that people are simply out to overturn their individual rights?
Sure. Well, the first point I like to make is that I think we're in much worse shape now than we were 2 years ago, because I think there's been so much confusion about public health and such a failure to connect with ordinary people that when we have another pandemic or another public health crisis, which is inevitable, I hope it doesn't happen soon, but it will happen eventually, people are going to shrug their shoulders and say, people in leadership don't do what they say they're going to do. The rules change all the time. I'm not going to be involved with that. And they're just going to throw their hands up. So that brief moment of unity, and people may forget this, there was this brief moment of unity when the pandemic first broke out, where most people were on the same page. Just like that moment of unity after 9/11. It was like a striking moment last March or April, a year and a half ago. It's going to be very hard to generate that again, even if something more deadly and more dangerous than COVID appears. But I think the underlying question is, how do you balance individual liberty against the overall public good? Typhoid Mary, for those people who don't know, is an extreme example. She was a carrier of a fatal disease that killed particularly children, but also adults and in large numbers. And nothing could be done about that. So they locked her on an island in the East River for many, many years and dropped her food off periodically. Fortunately, we don't find ourselves in that situation today, but we do find ourselves in situations, for example, where people with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis can be locked up for months or even a year at a time to take medication when they threaten others. So these threats are still out there. Ebola is another example. There were mandatory quarantines for Ebola. And I will add, many people out there today who object to the public health restrictions related to COVID were not out there saying people with Ebola should be able to wander the streets. So there is a continuum rather than a bright line for almost everybody.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's very much a continuum, and we definitely would say, oh yeah, someone with Ebola, right? Highly, high mortality rate, high infection rate. But then when you get to something like COVID, there's 80% of people don't have symptoms, 20% of people have symptoms, but only a handful of them have like a hospitalization rate, and then a smaller percentage of them have they're in a ventilated or on Ecmo. And so like we're just taking our own risks here. And so there really is this question about like what's the risk to the public, and then how do we navigate the conflict between those individual rights to sort of do what we want and take the risks we want, but also when is it wrong to put other people at risk? How high does the risk have to be?
And there's the direct risk of, for example, of me catching COVID from you, but there's the indirect risk. If you get COVID and you need that Ecmo machine, that someone else who needs a bypass operation can't get that Ecmo machine. And I think by now, all of us have seen on the news, for example, the case of the gentleman in Alabama who was turned out from 43 hospitals before he finally found one and succumbed to an MI. And those cases still are rare, but they are out there. And this question arises when we have not just limited resources in an economic way, but actually tangibly scarce hard resources like ventilators, ECMO machines, how we allocate them. I think the really concrete example we're seeing now are patients who have chosen not to get vaccinated, who as a result need solid organ transplants. And they're often very sick. And they're in essence bumping other people out of the line for transplants. So we've seen several cases now of patients getting double lung transplants who were not vaccinated. And these are presented as great human interest stories or great triumphs of science. People forget that there's someone out there with cystic fibrosis who didn't get a lung, who must have died as a result.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? It's not about necessarily the immediate resources of a ventilator versus a ventilator. It's the broader resources that are available that are scarce in general, such as organs, and the ways that disproportionately negatively affects people who would normally get the organs but can no longer have access to them.
And yet it's also hard. We don't penalize people for not engaging in other public health measures to protect
Sure.
themselves.
Yeah.
So if you are obese because you live in a food desert and you have poor access to nutrition and you need have a heart attack and need ventilation, we don't say, well, you ate too much. We say you're a victim of circumstance. And yet, if you live in an underserved community with poor healthcare literacy, and you choose not to get vaccinated as a result, some people would blame you for that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, we wrestle with that a lot with, individual providers concerned about, the decisions that led to their need for care. And then, of course, the sort of institution level decisions to allocate in a certain way, according to a certain protocol. Now, something that we see in my institution, I'm sure this is a nationwide problem, relates to this chapter that you have called "I Want a White Surgeon." And this discusses, you discuss uncomfortable cases where patients ask for or ask not to have people of a particular ethnicity or sex to treat them. And in my work, I've just seen this a disturbing number of times. And it's very difficult in each case to sort of navigate. It's going to be dependent on the details. But what's interesting to me is that in many cases, the decision comes down to the reasons for their request. And we don't think much about a woman asking for a woman doctor to perform an intimate exam. We recognize the sort of moral conundrum that a woman might be in, especially given the high rates of sexual assault in this country, why a woman would want a woman physician. We don't think much about that. But we would take special exception to a patient who refuses to be treated by a person of color simply because they don't trust people of color. So if you come across cases like this in your practice, and how do hospitals tend to handle these cases?
So this is actually one of the areas that I write about, and I wouldn't say specialize in, but I'm particularly interested in, because I think there is a continuum. On the one hand, there are what we consider pernicious requests, people who, and not just race, but for whatever reason, dislike one group of people without good justification, usually irrationally, or have misguided beliefs about their competence. And at the other extreme, there are social norms we all accept. I think in many hospitals, if you want a female obstetrician to deliver your baby, we feel comfortable with that. But there's a lot of gray area in between. If you are an African-American psychiatric patient and you say you want a Black provider because a white doctor can't understand what you've been through, that seems much more reasonable than something pernicious. And yet that also not just does that create a segregated care in a way, but it places a burden on Black providers who may not want to spend their time just treating Black patients. There becomes a tax in a way. The other example I often like to give is that the motivation is sometimes unclear. You may, as a male patient, want a male urologist because you don't feel comfortable with women touching certain parts of your body. Or you may want a male urologist because you, like everybody else, knows that men cut straighter. And that's obviously not true, but if that's your belief, how do we know which is which? And won't that create a moral hazard where you simply give us the answer we want to hear? The area where it comes up most often, I have found, and by far the most challenging, is not in the hospital setting, but in the home healthcare setting. It's people who, it's rarely the patient, it's the patient's relative. Somebody will say, I'm really embarrassed to ask you this, doctor, but my father, who is 80 years old and mildly cognitively impaired, he really needs a white home health aide. Because if you send him home with a non-white home health aide, he won't say that they're not competent because they're not white, but he'll find fault with them because he's prejudiced even if he doesn't realize it, and it'll be a mark on them and they'll get fired, and we'll just go through this until he gets someone he wants. Now, obviously, it's illegal to honor that request. On the other hand, it also seems like an unfair burden to put a home healthcare worker in that situation. And yet there's that old expression, you don't want to mount the revolution on the backs of the cognitively impaired. And so what you do is not an easy one.
Yeah, oh wow. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the home health angle. That's a really, it just adds a layer of complexity to the whole issue. I appreciate that. And in the inpatient setting where I work primarily, in many cases we work to accommodate even weird, seemingly irrational requests for the purpose of ensuring quality patient care, ensuring patient adherence to certain medical requests and that sort of thing. In some cases, we're not able to, like some specialists, if a patient says, I don't want Dr. X, a doctor who looks like X or something like that. The doctor's like, look, I'm the only specialist in the state who does this. And he's like, well, you have a choice, but your choice is to, this particular physician. But yeah, the home health situation, that's fascinating. I didn't realize that was such a new complication.
Yeah, no, it's a significant challenge. And unlike in the hospital setting where you can sort of draw a fairly hard and fast rule of certain forms of behavior, once the patient leaves the hospital, it's much harder to manage. And you're really asking some highly disempowered, low-paid home health aide to stand up for him or herself against the patient, and that's really hard to expect.
Yeah, and especially as you point out, right, if they find fault with them, then that's going to look bad on their evaluations and their review. They're going to have much more trouble transferring to a different position or remaining in the position that they have. Yeah, that's it's sort of double-edged in that sense.
So yeah, so I think from my perspective, when there's a clinical justification, it's fairly easy.
Sure.
So for example, we had a patient with a particular race who believed members of his own race were trying to poison him. It was a psychotic delusion. Really easy case because it's not malevolent, it's not willful. When it's a cultural norm, you have to ask yourself, how much do we let people embrace their own cultural norms when they're not the majorities and have a pernicious effect?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great way of thinking about it. I like that. So now in the chapter that sort of names your book, who says you're dead? You discuss some issues related to the determination of death by neurologic criteria. Now, this is a hot button issue, not just politically, but also in the scholarly literature. The medical question seems to be, are there unambiguous criteria for what counts as death? Something we could point to a biology textbook for and say, yep, this is death, this is not death. But, and since the early 80s, as you explained in your chapter, like superbly, you state that like the US has adopted a view that the two sets of criteria are legitimate, like the death by circulatory criteria or death by neurologic criteria. This is the Uniform Determination of Death Act. But yet some, even today, still say that circulatory criteria count as biological death. Like they want to claim it for science, for biology, for nature. They want to say this is biological death, and they want to set it apart from neurologic criteria. And there's a lot of traditions that support that. There are certain religious traditions that take umbrage at the idea that anything but circulatory criteria are legitimate. And so this suggests that the criteria of death is really value-laden in our society. And so I'm curious what you think about the role of values in these sort of medical claims.
Sure. Well, in my tradition, Judaism, death begins when you don't get into medical school. But I mention that only because death is very much constructed. You can be dead for one purpose and alive for another. We're wrapping up at 8, I guess.
Oh, I thought we had an hour. Okay.
Oh, I thought we had an hour too. So you may think about, for example, the return of Martin Gare or Enoch Arden in the Tennyson poem, people who are lost at sea and come back and their property's been given away and their families have remarried or their spouses remarried and they're both dead and alive. And then there are people who don't accept our definition of brain death. So for example, the Jesse Kuchin case, a young man whose family wanted to bring him home and keep him alive on a ventilator in their home. To what degree do we allow people to opt out? Oh, never mind. We have an hour, so I can keep talking. Perfect. So, and yet if I wanted to bring home my grandmother when she passed away and put her in my living room and prop her up like Lenin in his tomb, we wouldn't let me do that. Right. So it's a challenging question.
Yeah. And so, that's interesting. So, if you've got a family who's, I guess I should ask it this way. You mentioned your tradition is Judaism. Do you agree that states should have religious exceptions specifically, or should they be broader metaphysical exceptions for brain death determinations?
I think the challenge is it's not easy. And right now, the only state that in practice allows real opt-out is New Jersey. Patients often are transferred to New Jersey. Sure. New York technically does, but it doesn't occur in practice, and 48 other states don't. The challenge is death is simply not a choice or determination that affects you only. It affects others too. So whether or not you're dead or alive determines whether or not people inherit your property, whether or not your spouse can remarry, whether or not your disability payments continue. The example I always use without taking any political position, but you can imagine if Ruth Bader Ginsburg, rather than allowing her life support to be turned off, had decided to stay on life support after one flat EEG for another 4 months so that a different president could appoint a replacement. We would probably feel uncomfortable as a society with allowing that. So death transcends individual choices.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. Lots of things are affected by death determinations, and even just within the clinical setting, what sorts of responsibilities we have if you're alive or if you're dead makes a big difference. Whether we continue a certain amount of treatment or whether we're allowed, as far as legal and medical standards go, to do something different, to sign a death certificate, and all of the implications that go along with that. And then, of course, the whole idea of neurologic criteria for death arose out of the interest in organ procurement. And this notion that we have a dead donor rule. You have to be dead by some criteria in order for us to take your organs. And neurologic criteria allows us a much wider range of opportunities to have organs in the social system.
Yeah, so in that sense, the question really is, who says you're dead rather than when are you dead?
Yeah.
I'm reminded of, some of you may have seen this news event right before the pandemic, of a Romanian worker who had gone to work in Turkey and had not kept in touch with his wife. So after a long period of time, she went and declared him dead. And then he came back, and Romania insisted he was still dead, even though he was the same person. So he couldn't get a job and couldn't rent an apartment. And he went to court and he kept losing. So eventually, wow. I think the Romanian Supreme Court finally ruled in his favor, but it took him quite a long time to become alive, even though he was tangibly there.
Oh, that's fascinating. The sort of hurdles we make people jump through. All right. Well, I appreciate your time talking with me. You and I have eaten up a half hour, and I really appreciate that. We're going to turn it over to the audience now, and I'm going to start with the chat. There's chat and Q&A, so stay with me, Q&A, folks. We're going to just move sort of back and forth, but there is Rhonda McInnes in the chat. Says, I saw a chapter in your book devoted to ventilator allocation. I'm assuming this was written prior to the pandemic based on your earlier statement. Have you consulted on New York's or other states' crisis standards of care during the past 18 months?
So I have spoken extensively on crisis standards of care and written about it. I have not consulted with any state agencies making rules, probably because my views are not necessarily consistent with what they wish. But I mentioned, I think the great challenge in crisis standards of care is how you deal with individuals who've been marginalized by the healthcare system at baseline. Because most of the standards we use now for allocation use some combination of your overall life expectancy if you survive COVID, or your likelihood of surviving this particular episode and getting off the ventilator. But if you grow up in a community that has poor healthcare and you don't have access to medicine growing up, you're more likely to have the conditions that make you more susceptible to COVID. And then if we give you short end of the stick on getting a ventilator, you in essence have a double whammy. So how we balance that against the individual need for a ventilator is hard, because even fairly progressive people who may believe in holistic review or affirmative action for employment or for education feel very uncomfortable saying, you get the ventilator because you grew up disadvantaged, especially if you have a lower likelihood of survival. And that paradox is one that's very hard to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that answer. And it's interesting, a lot of the crisis standards of care in this country have been revised substantially in the past 18 months due to these concerns about disadvantages that the original crisis standards of care didn't take it into account. And I appreciated the national conversation on this.
I think the two other challenging issues that we really have not grappled with yet as a society are, one, we've talked a lot about allocating ventilators, but far less about allocating Ecmo machines, in which there are far fewer. So you can triage from the bottom with ventilators. You can say these people are unlikely to survive. This is what distinguishes them. At the high end of survival rates, you're going to have a pool of people, all of whom have a very high likelihood of doing equally well with an Ecmo machine. Maybe not well, but equally well. How you decide between them is challenging. And it's very hard to get data on who got access, but my sense is people with more social capital are more likely to get them. And the second challenge is when you really have a shortage of ventilators, and we never reached this point to this degree in the country, but we could have. How do you balance the two pools of ventilators, those in long-term care facilities and those in acute care settings? Is it ever ethical to take someone off a ventilator, in essence, kill them, if you can save dozens of lives? We sort of reached the gray area in the middle with the following kind of case. What do you do with a patient who comes into your ER with a C3, C4 spinal fracture, which means they've broken their neck and they need a ventilator for life? In normal times, we would give that person a ventilator without thinking twice. But if giving them a ventilator means taking that ventilator out of the pool of available ventilators, when you have a shortage that could save multiple lives, do you still do it? And I think that's sort of the closest we came as a challenge during this pandemic.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you know, there's so many other scarce resources that we didn't realize how scarce they were until the pandemic. I know in your state of New York, I've talked with ethicists where the palliative care folks are running out of pain medication for people at the end of life. Of course, we have resource shortages. The more staff members who are quarantined, the fewer staff members per patient. Especially when you have Ecmo cases where you have sometimes one-to-one requirements, nurse to patient. The moment we take a resource out of the equation, we've got ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely. Everything from dialysis machines to N95 masks across the board.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. So I'm trying to interpret this question. Maybe you can help me, Dr. Appel. What do you think of the doctor being in charge, given that she or he has proxy? I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. In our state, a doctor would never be a proxy decision maker, but under certain circumstances, if a patient were unrepresented, we have a process by which decisions are made. It's not typically just one physician, but maybe you can interpret that question a little bit.
Sure. So I think there are two different ways to interpret it. One is, what is the role of the doctor vis-a-vis the medical care team? And I hope to say that we've shifted away from an attending in charge model to a collaborative care model where we really want everybody's opinion. Otherwise, metaphorically speaking, planes crash. And most opinions, at least in psychiatry now, are in practice made by consensus. Or the question may be asking, what do I think about the paternalistic model where doctors make decisions for patients? And again, I'd like to think we have moved away from that substantially. When my grandmother was a breast cancer patient in the 1950s, she was treated at a hospital whose name I will not mention for legal purposes, but it shares the name of a prominent biblical mountain. And they told her that she had rheumatism and go home and enjoy her life. And they told her husband that she had 6 months to live. And the doctors made all the medical decisions. That was the norm. That's Big Daddy and Tennessee Williams' Cat in the Hot Tin Roof. That culture is long gone. Now it's really a patient-centered model. And the only times that courts or doctors make decisions is really when there's no knowledge what the patient would have wanted and no one to make decisions for them.
Yeah.
Someone in the chat asked what an Ecmo machine is, so I will answer very quickly.
Yeah.
Someone else answered that it's extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. That might have been you. But basically, it's a triage machine. It's if you fail ventilation, you fail a ventilator, but we still need a way of oxygenating your blood. It's the last step, the last option, but it's extremely expensive and very labor intensive. And most major teaching hospitals have a few machines versus dozens or hundreds of ventilators.
Yeah. Some people in the news have called it heart-lung bypass. It's something that's extracorporeal, so it's outside the body doing your work of your heart and your lungs. So someone asked, David Wyatt asked, do you see differences across the country regarding how well physicians practice basic ethical principles and concept? Here in the South, physicians tend to remain very paternalistic in communication and focused on their personal ethic dictating right and wrong medical choices without considering other variables.
So I'd like to think that we all are on the same page in terms of a patient-centric model. I will confess that I have spent limited time in the medical settings in the South, though I spent some time there socially when I was younger. But I do think we are shifting from a local model, I would like to think, over time toward a national model. So in a very concrete way, the standard of care for malpractice used to be local. So you used to be held to the standard of what they did in Little Rock, Arkansas, or Lower Manhattan. Now, if you're in Nome, Alaska, or you're at the Mayo Clinic, you're supposed to have the same knowledge, the same skills. You may not have the same equipment, but you can't say we're in Nome, Alaska, we don't know as much as they know at the Mayo Clinic. So I would like to think that ethics are following the same approach. We should have a patient-focused approach. I think a lot more of it may be generational than it is geographical. I think doctors who learned in a previous generation were taught to be more paternalistic. And candidly, as medicine has become more diverse, And medicine is far more diverse in some ways than it was a generation or 2 generations ago. My field, psychiatry, is becoming increasingly female, has changed the culture.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it may have to do with the type of center you're at as well. So in my center, we're an academic medical center. We're a team-based model. And so we're very much beholden to national standards because that's what we're teaching our residents and medical students. And so there's sort of a calibration effect that sort of helps prevent a certain kind of paternalism. Of course, there are other kind of paternalisms that sort of creep in with that sort of model. But as an ethicist, obviously part of my job is to help orient the team to the patient's interests and values in those cases where they may get lost. But yeah, and maybe other kinds of settings, and like you said, generationally, there may be some sort of holdout against the sort of national standard models. That's a good point.
And it may be shifting by field too. I mean,
Yeah.
in psychiatry, like my mother says, psychiatrists are almost real doctors. So we don't bring that same confident paternalistic air to our encounters. Some other specialties where people have to, I won't mention any fields, but in some fields, the motto is sometimes right, but always certain. And they may be slower to adopt this ethical norm. So I think we're all making progress in that regard.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good point. I like that. So another question's a little bit broader. An anonymous questioner says, do you feel there's an increase in bad behavior, and good ethical behavior, or do we just hear more about the bad things?
So I have no reason to believe that doctors are any worse now than they were 20 years ago. In fact, I would have many reasons to believe that people are providing much more ethical care on the whole. That being said, and the standards have changed in a way that I think is much more productive, much better. That being said, there's far more scrutiny. So we've become far more aware of the bad actors now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. I think you can listen to people's stories. I've talked to old-time doctors. People did egregious things in hospitals 30, 40 years ago. Just nobody ever caught them. Now, I would like to say that we always catch them, but at least sometimes we catch them. And I think simply the awareness of that makes people who would be bad actors second guess what they're going to do.
Yeah, that's a nice point. That we've got structures in place now that allow for far quicker and more accurate communication regarding certain practices. And so in some sense, it creates a check on our behavior. And in some sense, the part of the standardization of care has resulted in overall, better decisions, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, for example, I mean, we have IRBs now that review all research. Prior to the 1970s, you could do any research project you wanted, and the only checking that was your conscience and the hospital administration. And unfortunately, people did lots of things that we look back on and wonder how anybody could do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So we got a question here, and it's a specific question. I think a couple of your chapters address end of life issues more broadly speaking, or life limiting conditions. But this Mary Douglas asks, what ethical experiences have you had with ALS patients? And we know that ALS is a specific kind of life limiting condition, but there are a number of different life limiting conditions similar to ALS. I don't know if you had comments on that.
Sure. So I'm trying to separate my personal experiences because I've had several close personal experiences which raised ethical questions with my clinical ones. But I think the hardest question with ALS patients is ALS patients raise a unique issue in relation to aid in dying or assisted suicide. And that many of them want to live past the point where they can't make the physical choices to end their own lives. They want to live up to the point where they're no longer able to engage meaningfully with those around them. And yet once they reach that point, even in jurisdictions which do allow for aid in dying, they're unable to make that choice because they physically can't do it. And I would actually suggest that ALS is one of those rare cases where we probably want an exception to that general rule, where the patient authorizing someone else to make this decision for them is strong enough rather than actually physically doing it.
Yeah, it's a great point. It reminds me of the idea that medical ethics, grounded in principles. Principles are good insofar as they capture the relevant circumstances. But as you point out, there are certain medical conditions in light of the technologies that we have that very much make for new sorts of little outlier circumstances. We might have to say, look, our principles just don't cover that. We need an exception for X. Because we understand what's ethically at stake for this patient, and the way our principles sort of traditionally have run don't allow us to accommodate that.
Yeah, so the way I'd like to describe it is I think a perfectly well-intentioned, justice-minded person could believe in aid in dying for those with ALS. And a perfectly well-intentioned, justice-valuing person could believe that the downsides of allowing this outweigh the benefits. But it's hard for me rationally to see the difference between saying someone who pushes a button can end their own life, but someone who tells someone else to push a button can end their own life. You could argue that it's not a role for doctors to play, because doctors may then have dual loyalties and people may wonder, are their doctors really on their side? But you could create a field of specialists, thanatologists, whose simply job it is to push buttons when authorized by mentally capable ALS patients. So, I mean, there are all sorts of permutations, but I don't like logical fallacies that attach to larger principles.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful point. Thanatologist. So we got the Greek word for death, thanatos. So thanatology. I like that solution. So as we close out here, we've got about 12 minutes to go. Someone has asked, and I appreciate this change of direction, because you do a lot more than medical ethics stuff. You do a lot of fiction writing. And someone says, oh, I just lost it. I enjoyed your previous visit at our book festival when you presented on your book of short stories. How does your writing intersect with your professional career?
Sure. So I want to tell a joke that will sum this up perfectly. A rabbi goes out on Yom Kippur, the holiest of Jewish holidays, to play golf. And he scores a hole-in-one on every hole. And the angels turned to God and said, what are you doing? Why are you rewarding this man rather than punishing him? And God says, but who can he tell? That is my experience every day in the hospital. I hear the most amazing stories in psychiatry, and I can't share them with anyone. So with that in mind, I think it pushes my imagination, because I have to then think of stories that are more unusual or outside the box, even of what I'm hearing in the hospital. So very little of the content that I experience is ever included in my stories, but the motivation to think outside the box is usually there.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I appreciate that. I love fiction. I think fiction really captures an aspect of life that so much of our scientific discourse can't. Do you find that in psychiatry, that your sort of interest in fiction and your writing fiction helps facilitate conversation with patients?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it really, when writing a story, you have to be able to step into the shoes of all the characters, even those you don't agree with or have unusual views. And in the same way, I think in the emergency room, particularly in psychiatry, you really need to be able to step into the patient's shoes for a while and figure out why they're seeing the world they are, or you're not going to be able to help them. And I think most challenges in the emergency room, and I get yelled at a lot, don't come because people disagree with each other. They come because people think they disagree with each other.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. We have a literature and medicine class where we try to do that very thing. We try to help people see the ways in which their perspective underscores the way they're framing their issue, which may not be a disagreement, but it just may be the way they're seeing the world differently. And once you understand the way they're seeing the world, it's not a disagreement. It's about figuring out how we're best going to match up medicine with this person's needs.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so there's another question here, that sort of relates the two. I mean, I think it relates the two between your fiction writing and your work in medical ethics. Ronna McKinnon asked, do you have suggestions for creating a more welcome inclusion by individual practitioners of hospitals or regional ethics committees when faced with complex ethical challenges? So I'll read it again because it's, I stumbled a little bit. Do you have suggestions for creating a more welcome inclusion by individual practitioners of hospital or regional ethics committees when faced with complex ethical challenges?
Well, I think the question is asked, because I've seen this practically, is people bring their cases before the ethics committees, and they feel like the ethics committees speak from on high and give them lots of very rigid, somewhat demeaning advice. So I think it's very, very important that ethics committees realize who their constituents are. If there were not doctors and patients, there would be no need for ethics committees. And I think part of that is welcoming people into the ethics committee. And I think ethics committees should in general be open to practitioners. I think anybody who wants to sit in on an ethics meeting to see how they work should be welcome to sitting on a meeting and see how they work, obviously with HIPAA and confidentiality, any clinician in the system. But I also think it's really important to recognize that the providers coming to the committee have expertise of their own, often expertise far in excess of the committee members in the field they're dealing with. And you really don't want to lose sight of that.
Yeah, that's a nice point too. It's like the idea that there are multiple perspectives and multiple sets of expertise at the table. We have complex ethical decisions, and so you can't presume that there's this sort of authoritarian one direction perspective on a particular case. You have to have those details. You have to have that expertise informing the decision. Well, I don't see other questions. If you have questions, please put them in either the Q&A or the chat. I'm watching both.
I like to remind people that medicine is a long track record of being wrong, and that's the kind of humility you have to bring into the clinical setting and the ethical setting. So I always, Franz Alexander is one of my favorite figures in psychiatry, because in the late 1940s, he wrote about these 7 conditions that were psychogenic in nature and had no biological basis. And they included asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis Crohn's, eczema, hypertension, and hyperthyroidism. So, and he was a national figure, so you never know.
Yeah, you never know. That's right. That's right. Medical, the history of medicine is one of these interestingly fraught one of these interestingly fraught disciplines with, sort of arrogance and failure that culminates in this massive amount of success with things like vaccines and antibiotics and surgeries.
So I see someone has asked, what are your thoughts when complex situations go to court, in the chat box? And my answer is lawyers, and more or less nobody, and I say that as a lawyer, and more or less nobody else. At all costs, you want to avoid making a situation, even if it's a tense one, into a litigious one. That being said, and I can't emphasize this enough, almost all cases that end up in court have numerous steps along the way where an ounce of prevention could have prevented a pound of cure. And it's simply nobody be willing to step back, either whether it's filling out an advance directive initially or meeting with the family regularly to prevent these scenarios from brewing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Ron McKinnon asked, and I like this question. I hadn't thought about it in the way we frame certain treatment options for patients. Do you feel that families would be better served by eliminating the term life support in favor of organ or system support to help the families get past the psychological idea of removing life from their family member, especially in the cases of patients dead by neurologic criteria?
That's an interesting thought. The broader take-home point I'd like to suggest is how we phrase things plays a very large role in the decisions patients make. So taking the opposite extreme, opposite of life support, what if you said to the patient's family, would you like us to pursue heroic measures to save your relative, or would you like to let nature take its course? Now, that is an accurate description as much as life support may be an accurate description, but it will get you a very different outcome. So the challenge is figuring out what is an impartial or neutral way to help the family make their decision rather than make your decision.
Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, we know from, at least we have some insights from the behavioral psychology folks, that any choice we present to people is going to have a certain architecture to it. It's going to be framed a certain way. It may be framed positively or negatively, depending on how the physician feels about the choice in the very beginning.
And it's a dyad. So language that means one thing to one patient may mean something very different to a different patient. And there's no way to know that unless you know the family well.
Yeah.
Being liberated from a ventilator may mean 2 very different things to 2 very different people.
Yeah, it's a great point. We talk a lot about shared decision making, but that really is just the means of just a matter of getting to know the family and the patient and their values and their interests in medicine, so you can know even how to frame some of the options that are available to them to determine what would what particular choice would be meaningful. Depends on how they would understand the framing in the first place.
I mean, that's the hardest thing for me about the ER. Is in the ICU, you have days often to figure out what the patient's family's wishes are. In the ER, you often have minutes.
Yeah.
And yet you're trying to get a meaningful social history and context to help them make a decision.
That's right. Well, we've only got about 3 minutes left, and I apologize to those of you who are asking in the chat some questions that we're not going to get to. But we've been talking about Dr. Jacob Appel's Who Says You're Dead? Medical and Ethical Dilemmas for the Curious and Concerned. And just as a reminder, you can get the book through the Six Bridges Book Festival website. You can get it on Wordsworth books, or a number of different places you can pick up this book. It's a number of different vignettes that prompt people to ask, what would you do in these complicated medical scenarios? And we've gotten a sense from Dr. Appel that ideally it would help you frame and understand your own medical situations in the future to help predict what sort of decisions you might make, what sort of conversations you might have with families. Any final thoughts from you, Dr. Appel, on your book and what it could mean for our audience?
Sure. Well, I always like to end all of my talks by saying, because many of the people here are clinicians in one capacity or another, is that you should never forget that your worst day as a provider is always better than your best day as a patient. And if you take that with you into work every day, you're going to do a great job. And the other lasting advice I always share is a close friend of mine's grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. And she used to say, if you get to sleep in your own bed at the end of the day, your day couldn't have been that bad. But then I would ask her, but I work in a psychiatric emergency room overnight. What does that mean? And she would say, it's too late for you. So on that note, I thank you all.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Appel. We appreciate the book. We appreciate the conversation. Thank you all for your the audience for participating, for joining us, for your questions. It's really been enjoyable, and wish you all the best. And Dr. Appel, I hope I run into you in the future.
Same here. I hope to get to Arkansas one day, maybe for a future festival.
That sounds great. Thanks, everybody.
Be well. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.